In our series of highlighting infrastructural development in the Sahel, today our camera lens focuses on Burkina. Stay with us as we take a walk together to unravel some of the works of President Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso is trying something most African states only talk about: cutting loose from old guardians while still asking them to keep the lights on. Since the 2022 takeover that brought Ibrahim Traoré to power, the capital has shifted from an aid-dependent partner to an open challenger of the old West African order built around France, regional bodies, and foreign troops. Together with neighboring military authorities in the Sahel, he helped create a new alliance that later deepened into a wider confederation project, promising collective security and sovereignty across the region. On paper, it looks like a revolution. On the ground, it's a high-risk text. The core question is simple but uncomfortable. Is this new Sahel blueprint building real independence or just changing who Burkina Faso depends on? The country has pushed out French special forces, torn up long-term standing defense deals, and started turning towards new partners for weapons, training, and investment. At the same time, it's signing fresh agreements on energy, transport, and even possible nuclear cooperation. Better that new infrastructure will unlock growth and sovereignty at the same time. In this episode, the focus is on Burkina Faso's attempt to redesign its future from the ground up. How this new Sahel alliance became the front line of that experiment, and why this struggle over roads, power grids, and regional ties could reshape who really holds power in the Sahel. The rupture with old partners in Burkina Faso don't start with fiery speeches on television. It started when the military authorities quietly began changing the rules on who could station troops, sign security deals, and influence long-term development in the Sahel. For years, the country leaned heavily on Western military missions and development programs that, for many people, failed to stop spreading insurgencies. The new leadership decided that the price of that support was too high, especially when it came with pressure over timelines for political transition and outside red lines on security strategy. The turning point became obvious in early 2023 when Burkina Faso ended its defense agreements with France and asked French special forces to leave without a short period. That move was more than a tactical shift. It sent a signal to foreign capitals that the country planned to choose its own allies, even if that meant losing funding, training, and diplomatic comforts. Soon after this, coordination with its Sahel neighbors intensified, and by around 2023 to 2024, the three military governments moved from shared frustration with sanctions to formally build a joint Sahel alliance that later announced a deeper confederation project. In this new reality, Burkina Faso isn't just another fragile state searching for security assistance. It became a testing ground for a bigger idea that Sahelian governments can design a regional model based on mutual defense, political solidarity, and new development partners, rather than older regional blocs and Western sponsorship. But to understand why the authorities are willing to accept isolation and uncertainty for this part, it's necessary to go back and trace how this dependence was built into the country's roads, dams, and power lines in the first place. Long before anyone spoke about Sahel stabilization or counter-terror coalitions, the basic layout of Burkina Faso's infrastructure reflected a different goal: extraction, not integration. Under colonial rule, transports, links across much of West Africa were designed mainly to move cotton, minerals, and other raw materials from inland territories towards coastal ports controlled by European powers. They were not designed to connect landlocked populations to each other or to domestic markets. Railways ran towards the sea. Roads were focused on export corridors. Internal connections, especially between rural regions, lagged behind. At independence, Burkina Faso and its neighbors inherited this structure and the financing habits that went with it. Successive governments relied on loans, grants, and technical help from former colonial powers, European bodies, and global lenders to expand or maintain roads, power networks, and telecommunications. These projects did bring some improvements, but they often stayed tied to foreign contractors, foreign currency debt, and policy conditions that limited how far states could move away from preferred economic models pushed from the outside. In key areas like electricity and transport, dependence wasn't just about where the money came from. It was also about who supplied the equipment, who trained the engineers, and who controlled maintenance and software. Each new highway, dam, or grid link carried an invisible list of obligations. Over time, it meant decisions on tariffs, routes, and even which regions got priority were shaped as much by relationship with donors and outside partners by the domestic planning. For Burkina Faso today, breaking with that model is not only a political decision, it's an attempt to challenge the basic logic that made its economy outward facing and structurally dependent. Yet, even as that deep blueprint tightened, a new generation of leaders and movements inside the country began insisting that independence had to matter more than impressive project announcements. The push for a different path didn't only come from the military or presidential offices. It built up over years as ordinary people watched insecurity worsen, rural communities fall further behind, and foreign-backed initiatives failed to change daily life in villages and crowded suburbs. Repeated attacks by armed groups, people forced to flee their homes, and frustration with that many saw an elite compromise, creating a mood where promises of stability no longer carried weight without visible change. In this atmosphere, Pan-African idea and the memory of figures like Thomas Sankara took a new life, especially among young people who saw links between past struggles for sovereignty and today's arguments over foreign truths and economic dependence. Public debates started to tie demands for security to demands for dignity, with the argument that development, which leaves real decision-making power outside the country, is incomplete. When the military took power in 2022, it inherited not just a security crisis, but a population ready to see proof that this government would break from earlier ones that managed ties with donors and former colonial powers more cautiously. As the new authorities looked for support, they faced a central tension. Western states and international bodies still offered financing equipment and diplomatic backing, but usually tied to expectations about timelines, reforms, and political alignments. At the same time, parts of the domestic audience wanted clear symbols of sovereignty, less reliance on traditional partners, and visible moves towards alternative alliances. Under this pressure, Burkina Faso's leaders chose a more confrontational track, one that would redraw alliances and redefine who is trusted to help build the country's future. As ties with France and regional organizations soured, Burkina Faso's authorities started deepening relations with actors who presented themselves as more flexible on political conditions and more in tune with the language of sovereignty. Within the Sahel, coordination with Mali and Niger solidified into a joint Sahel alliance, a bloc that pledged mutual defense and highlighted regional self-reliance in security and development plans. Beyond the region, the country looked towards powers such as Russia and others willing to offer military cooperation, training, and investment in infrastructure and energy. These newer relationships promised to bring in equipment, technical know-how, and project funding without the same public pressure over governance rules or quick electoral timetables that often came with Western negotiation. For Burkina Faso's leadership, spreading its alliances was a way to reduce reliance on any single power center and to gain room to maneuver on both security and economic policy. But changing partners doesn't automatically remove the risk of dependence. Deals on energy projects, arms supplies, and big infrastructure still create long-term obligations, from repayment schedules to strategic access. Limited public information around some of these arguments and the gap in technical expertise between Burkina Faso and its larger partners raise questions about whose interests will ultimately be best served. For many citizens, the question is straightforward. Will these new alliances finally lead to better security, more reliable electricity and jobs, or will they copy earlier patterns where big projects favor a small circle while most people keep waiting for change? To see whether this blueprint truly marks a break with the past, it's necessary to look closely at how Burkina Faso is reshaping its most concrete tools of control and connectivity with its energy and infrastructure networks. Away from summits and strong speeches, some of the most decisive work is happening quietly on maps, planning tables, and engineering drawings. Burkina Faso's authorities and their partners are revising plans for electricity networks, transport corridors, and digital links that will shape how people, goods, and data move within the country and across borders. For a landlocked state, choices about where new lines run and who controls them sit at the heart of any promise of independence. In energy spaces, talks with Russia on civilian nuclear power show the scale of the country's ambitions to tackle chronic electricity shortages and support industrial growth. At the same time, Burkina Faso is still involved in regional power sharing and grid linking efforts meant to the Sahelian network more closely together, potentially reducing exposure to single suppliers or external checkpoints. Now, plans for roads and trade routes increasingly stress connections within the new Sahel alliance. Between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rather than only to coastal ports under the influence of other blocs. Digital infrastructure is part of this story too. Expanding fiber optic lines and mobile coverage can strengthen state presence, support local businesses, and shape whose platforms dominate information flows. But every project forces decisions about funding, ownership, and maintenance. Short-term money from power partners can also speed up construction, yet it can also lock in new forms of leverage if key assets or technologies stay in outside hands. In that sense, each new power line, highway, or data cable forces Burkina Faso to balance immediate development needs against the longer-term goal of strategic autonomy. And infrastructure on its own can't resolve that tension, especially when pressure grows from actors who prefer the older arrangements. The more firmly Burkina Faso and its Sahel partners insisted on settling their own parts, the more clearly outside pressure showed up. Sanctions and suspensions from regional bodies limited access to regional financial markets and made trade more complicated, while critical messages from Western governments and international institutions framed the leaders' choices as dangerous for stability and governance standards. Cuts or freezes in aid and security cooperation, combined with diplomatic distance, raised the immediate price of following an alternative route. These outside pressures landed on top of hard realities on the ground. Despite new alliance and strong sovereignty language, armed groups stayed active across large parts of the Sahel, threatening key roads, disrupting local economies, and testing state capacity, keeping basic services running, electricity, health, education, in such conditions is so difficult with strong outside backing. During this relation, traditional partners are strained, and this adds another layer of access. The authorities have to manage expectations among citizens who want both quick improvements and visible proofs of independence. Balancing military operations, social spending, and infrastructure projects with less external financial space is a complex job on its own. At the same time, Pan-African voices, media platforms, and activists around the continent have increasingly cast Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as pioneers, trying out a new route away from dependence on former colonial powers and setting global institutions. This mix of criticisms, constraints, and symbolic support highlights a basic reality. Asserting sovereignty comes with short-term costs that not every state is willing or able to carry. With the stakes rising and the margin for error shrinking, the critical question is whether Burkina Faso can turn its Sahel blueprint into a workable model that others might one day borrow instead of a path they decide to avoid. As Burkina Faso moves through these first years of its experiment, audiences across Africa are watching less for isolated headlines and more for emerging patterns. The country's path pulls together many threads: the legacy of colonial-era infrastructure designed for extraction, growing anger at externally driven security strategies, the pull of strong sovereignty narratives, and the search for partners beyond the usual Western circle. Early results are missed. On one side, the creation and deepening of the Sahel Alliance and the Confederation project point to a new type of regional solidarity that is built around mutual defense and a shared political space outside older blocs. The decision to send French forces home and resist regional pressure has carried strong symbolic weight for those who see these steps as overdue corrections in West African relations. On the other side, insecurity remains intense. Economic pressures are heavy, and many of the promised infrastructure and energy projects are still only on paper or in very early stages. For other African states, Burkina Faso's experience raises uncomfortable questions. Is it possible to build roads, dams, and digital networks that increase autonomy instead of locking in new kinds of independence? Can governments reshuffle their alliances without shaking short-term stability? And how much economic and diplomatic pressures are leaders ready to accept in exchange for more control over their own policies? In the end, Burkina Faso's Sahel blueprint is more than a national gamble. It's a life test of whether African countries can redesign development on their own terms, or whether older blueprints drawn up elsewhere will simply come back with different partners and new labels. This is Frontline Africa. If this kind of unfiltered Africa First analysis resonates with you, make sure you are subscribed. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. My name is P. Solomon, and I'll see you in the next episode.